to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Good afternoon. I want to welcome you. My name is Larry Jacobs, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Politics here at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota. And it's a pleasure to begin. I want to just mention as we get started here that we value participation and conversation. So please give us questions. You'll see there'll be cards marching around for you to fill out. And if you're coming to us online, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. That's your opportunity to weigh in. We really count on those. Also, if you're tuning in online, you'll see at the bottom next to that Q&A button, there's a closed caption service if you'd like to use that. We are excited to have Russ Feingold with us, our program, America's Future. I think many of you are quite familiar with Russ Feingold. He is a rock star. He served in the Senate for 3 terms from 1993 through 2011. Before that, he was a Wisconsin state senator. And so this is one of those people who worked his way up. I kind of like that style. And then he's been, until quite recently, the president of the American Constitution Society. I thought it was quite interesting because Russ Feingold is from the progressive side of the Democratic Party. He ranks as a 6th in the Senate in terms of bipartisan voting while he was there. I don't know how you pull that off, but it's impressive. Most recently, we're going to talk about this. He wrote a book, co-authored book called The Constitution and Jeopardy. This is a very important book, and we're going to get into it right now. Thank you so much for being here. You're going to have to use this. Yep.
Thank you, Professor, very much for the invitation.
Describe this as the Russ Feingold tour. We're gonna hit some of the high points in your career and then come up to date because Senator Feingold has got a number of projects he's working on right now that are urgently important. Let's start with campaign finance. With John McCain, you marshaled the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act in 2002. It was considered then to be the most important effort to begin to put some guardrails around campaign finance. Then the Supreme Court toppled it in Citizens United in 2010. Where are we now?
First of all, Professor, thank you for inviting me. I do want to do a couple of quick acknowledgments. Thank you to the Humphrey School. I had the honor of seeing Hubert Humphrey. In fact, in his last big primary evening in Wisconsin, I got to shake his hand. Former staff member of mine, Trevor Miller, has been here at the university here for 15 years, a vice dean of the School of Design, College of Design, Feingold staffer. Laura Bishop, one of the leading environmentalists in the state, worked on my 1992 campaign, who worked for us in Washington and has had her own experiences with politics here in the state from what I've read. And I know she's involved with the Humphrey School. And you know, if you want to feel old, when not your nephew, but your great nephew shows up for your speech because he's a senior, Elliot Imig is already that's when you, but he's a great young man. And most importantly, I want to thank Professor Ford Runge, who's the reason I'm here. Ford and I had the thrill of being Rhodes Scholars together at Oxford 50 years ago. And we both we're from Wisconsin, of course, but got to be friends. But we had just a wonderful conversation this morning. Of course, he's a very distinguished professor here. And thank you, Ford, for inviting me. Campaign finance in 30 seconds. Well, look, when I ran for the Wisconsin State Senate, we had a actually functioning public funding program. And all I had to do was raise $17,000 from $100 or less contributions. So I wrote to every cousin that I knew or didn't know and got $10, and we got our money and we got the matching, $35,000. That was enough for me to win the election by 31 votes out of 47,000 against an 83-year-old incumbent. So I kind of came into this whole thing believing that money and politics should not be so intertwined. It is in many ways a fairly recent phenomenon in the last 50 years, these enormous expenditures in campaigns. We had a functioning presidential system that was not, there weren't differentials in the money spent in the presidential elections until relatively recently. So when I came to Washington, there were many other people that were already working on campaign finance, but I was interested. But we got clobbered in 1994, as you may remember, in the election by Newt Gingrich and those folks. And all of a sudden, we were in the minority in the Senate by a significant amount. But I get a call from a guy who I hadn't even really talked to, John McCain, and he said, I want to work on reform issues with you. So we did the McCain-Feingold bill, which took 8 years. It was the best-known bipartisan bill probably the last 50 years. And by the way, it's still the law of the land. Many people believe that it was overturned, but that was the Citizens United decision overturned a 1907 law sponsored by Wisconsin Senator Robert M. La Follette and signed by President Teddy Roosevelt that banned corporations from giving money to political campaigns. That's what they overturned in one of the worst decisions in the history of the court. They might still overturn the soft money ban of McCain-Feingold. That's coming up soon. But they did not do it, largely because Chief Justice Roberts wouldn't go along with it. But, of course, your basic point is correct, which is the system was completely gutted by the Citizens United decision. The way I describe it is McCain and I walked up to a brick wall and saw that one of the bricks was missing, and we decided to spend 8 years to get a new brick. And so we got the new brick in and we put it in, it's all good. And a bulldozer came and knocked over the whole wall and the brick's still intact. So that's where we're at. And if you take a look at those folks that were sitting at the inauguration of Donald Trump, none of them would have been able to give anything like that kind of money to political campaigns. Elon Musk would have been able to give $4,000. And this is the complete collapse of this system. And both parties have been involved in it. The Supreme Court said in Citizens United that it's premised on two things. One is that there would not be any coordination with candidates or parties. If you believe that, the Brooklyn Bridge is yours. Secondly, they said there has to be disclosure of these contributions. Congress has to pass a disclosure law, which is what Mitch McConnell used to say to me and McCain. He said, oh, all we need is sunlight disclosure. Well, they immediately changed their position on that. So it's a feckless law, and the Federal Elections Commission is a feckless agency for a variety of reasons that I won't go into right now unless you want me to. What are we going to do about it? Well, we have to get back to some kind of mechanisms of public financing. When the Democrats were in charge of the House a couple of years ago, the H.R. 1 included a system where you could go back to basically deducting or getting a credit for $50 to $100 a person to contribute to campaigns. We need to turn the Federal Elections Commission into an enforcement agency, and we need to pass a disclosure law. And then someday we have to overturn Citizens United. But what I'm talking about here are ways that we could accomplish some of these things, if people were willing to, without this current court doing it, which is not going to happen.
So let's talk about transparency. There has been some criticism that the focus in McCain-Feingold on soft money opened the door to dark money, and that what we really need is a thoroughgoing transparency campaign. And we're not going to get public financing, but maybe we can start to make progress on transparency so we can pull back the curtains and see where that money's coming from.
Yeah, of course, transparency is what I was just talking about, the disclosures. But first of all, as to the idea that McCain-Feingold opened the door to dark money is completely ridiculous. This is something that political scientists have made up. I was in the room and watched in Washington as these contributions were siphoned sometimes through the Democratic Party Senate Campaign Committee. I refused to raise the money this way, but I saw what was happening. Wink and a nod. It was direct corruption as a result of soft money contributions that were actually raised directly by candidates or office holders. So, of course, we have to do something about this, but the McCain-Feingold bill was working between 2004 and 2010. You did not have all this stuff swishing around. That decision undid our work, which was actually working very well. And the corporations and others who wanted to take over our political system didn't like it. So they engineered the Citizens United decision. So, but of course, the disclosure is critical.
Let's move on to another topic. One of the things that the mic's not working. Hello? Okay, it is good. Okay, I just need to hold it closer. Okay, we'll do that. One of the other issues you worked on very closely was your opposition to free trade. You voted very consistently against free trade and NAFTA and other sorts of major pieces of legislation. Obviously, the opposition to trade has become a major issue now. What's your position on the use of tariffs as a way to try to roll back trade?
Well, first of all, channeling my lost and your lost friend, Paul Wellstone, I'm not against free trade. I'm for fair trade. I've never said I'm against free trade. Many trade agreements over the years that have been perfectly reasonable. But I was elected in 92 and came in, and one of the first things that not the Republicans, but Bill Clinton and Al Gore wanted to do was jam through NAFTA. And, I was open-minded about it, but I had this, I was talking to Ford about it today, I had this thing I promised to do when I ran for the Senate. I put the promises on my garage door. And my promise was that I would go to every one of Wisconsin's 72 counties and hold an open town meeting where I didn't say anything at the beginning other than maybe one bill I was working on, then people could bring up what they wanted. So NAFTA comes up, and a lot of pressure in Washington from the sort of middle of the road Democrat types that were trying to push this thing, Harold Ford and some of those people. Of course, the unions were very much against it in a lot of the industrial towns in Wisconsin that have been hollowed out in many ways. But what struck me is that when I went to the Republican counties, and there were many of them, such as Green Lake County, great golf courses, but not many Democrats, all of a sudden the small business people showed up, Republicans, and said, don't do this thing. What you're going to do is get rid of the Evinrude company or whatever, the one thing in that town that employed people who went and bought the cars, who went and bought the food in their town. And so I came to the conclusion that this was not set up in a way to protect the industrial and working base of the state of Wisconsin. And I think I was right. And unfortunately, others have exploited it, such as the president and others, in a way that has allowed people to actually believe he will, do something about it. But it has become a political weapon, and I think it was a mistake for Democrats to not do this in a way that would protect American jobs.
How could they have done that? How could they have done this fair trade as you're talking about? There's been a lot of debate about this. And
I don't have all the details of how it can be done. I can tell you this, Mr. Runge here was instrumental in making sure some protections were put in place for labor and environment. And so there was an attempt to do that, but in the end, the temptation was too great to move the jobs not only out of seas, but overseas. And that's where, frankly, I also opposed, along with Jesse Helms, another one of my lesser known bipartisan efforts, the so-called preferred nation status for China, because I felt that American corporations were licking their chops to move the jobs over there and get cheap labor, and look what's happened. I think it's part of the reason we're in this mess with China right now. So, I know it sounds like I always opposed trade agreements, but these happen to be the trade agreements at the time, and I think they have led to disastrous consequences.
And do you think tariffs have no role in this?
I think tariffs are a mistake. I think what's going on now is, first of all, I think it's unconstitutional. I think the Supreme Court is going to rule that way. So that's my first concern. The idea that we're going to have economic governing by whim, how somebody felt at 3 o'clock in the morning about a certain country, is obviously not a good economic policy. And that's why the founders of this country thought maybe this should be something that the president can't do on his own.
Let's move on to another topic. Article 5 in the Constitution outlines how the Constitution can be modified. And there are two routes. One is 2/3 of the House and the Senate can propose a constitutional amendment, and then 3/4 of the states ratify it. There's another path, less well known, less talked about, is 2/3 of the state apply for a constitutional convention, and then Congress has to call it. At this moment, there are 34 states who have signed on to this idea of a constitutional convention. Our guest today, Senator Feingold, has written a profound book called Constitution and Jeopardy. What's the argument?
Well, the first thing you got to know about the book is it was co-authored with a student of mine named Peter Prindeville. And when you find a student who's smarter than you are and who's willing to write most of the book, you should say, okay. So Peter and I came together on this because I created maybe the first law school class in the country on Article 5, just on constitutional amendments. And it never comes up at law schools. Why? Because there's been so few constitutional amendments in American history, because we have the hardest constitution to amend in the entire world. It was set up in a very complicated way, and we haven't had a constitutional amendment for 50 years. And frankly, I believe we need some. Unfortunately, though, the idea of having a constitutional convention involves a very different approach. It will remind you of the Electoral College. It is state by state. 2/3 of the states merely have to send a petition to Congress saying we want a constitutional convention. And Congress is obligated to call the convention. It's not like Congress gets to vote on it. This was a finalizing debate in Philadelphia when the Constitution was ratified. Originally, it was going to just be the states that could do it, or the country. But Alexander Hamilton prevailed to have Congress do it. He wanted only the Congress do it, but then George Mason said that I'm leaving. And so on the last day, they came up with this mechanism. It's come close several times, particularly under Everett Dirksen's leadership. They tried to do it on reapportionment back in the early 60s, but it has never actually happened. Now, and this is what we write about, Professor, there is a movement since 2010, sort of combined with the Tea Party movement, the Mercers, the Koch brothers, and others, to use a sort of right-leaning approach to calling a constitutional convention, and to have that be called by a conservative Congress, and the vote at the convention would be state by state, not based on the size of the state. And so you can imagine what they're coming up with. They want to eliminate the ability of the federal government to have an income tax. They want to get rid of the things like the Environmental Protection Agency. And what I consider maybe the most extreme is they want what I would describe as the John C. Calhoun provision, with a nullification procedure, where a majority of the state legislatures, not the people in the state, but the majority of the state legislatures, just a majority, can nullify any act of Congress. And it passed over unanimously with cheering at various mock conventions they've had. So as I said to the professor before, I think the momentum on this, which was very strong, has been stifled a little bit by all the things that are going on with Trump. They're sort of figuring out they can maybe get it all done by Trump doing executive orders. But it probably will be coming back, and it is a real threat to have a different constitution engineered by this.
When you look at the history of this country, it stands out, as you said, it's very difficult to get done. Why are you so sure or so worried about this moment and this approach? You know, the odds are, checks continue, and getting 2/3 of the states is difficult.
3/4.
3/4 of the states is difficult.
Well, my answer to that is always just a numbers thing. If they can get 2/3 of the states to call for the convention, it's only 4 more states to get 3/4. So I don't think there's protection in that at all. It'll be probably individual items will be voted on. I think it's very possible, as has happened in the past, that there would be momentum toward passing many of those provisions. So hopefully that would work, but I am concerned that it would not.
There's a question from our audience, takes a slightly different position. It asks, do our political divisions stem from the fact that it's so hard to modify and change the U.S. Constitution by amendment?
I mean, I think that is creating some serious problems, and in particular, the fact that we have not been able to get rid of the Electoral College, and it's completely changed the course of American history in my lifetime, is very serious. But I think the reasons we're not getting along so well goes to what I like to call our loss of American identity. I feel like somehow this country in the last few years has gone from a country where a president might stand up after a tragedy or something like Gerald Ford said this, and others, and LBJ, to look out at the crowd, to look at the Congress, to look to the American people and say, my fellow Americans. It doesn't feel like it anymore, does it? I used to be comforted by that. I thought one of the greatest speeches I've ever heard was by the second George Bush right after 9/11. I didn't like anything he did afterward, but he got up there and he spoke to us all as one people. And it doesn't feel like that anymore. It doesn't feel like that in my state. It doesn't feel like that in a lot of, we're on, it's the Packers versus the Bears, more importantly, the Packers versus the Vikings now. And, what I've been thinking about lately is, how did we get here? Why is it that it's like that? And this is a very long subject, but to summarize it, somebody that's been in politics for a long time, that's old enough to have a great nephew here, a senior in college, is I've watched people change from being people who kind of saw each other as part of a community. In Janesville, Wisconsin, there, of course, was a memorial to the many people from there who died in the Bataan Death March. And there was this attitude toward everybody in the community that we were one community. Those generations, and many of them were still around when I first ran in 1992 for the Senate, those generations had been through the Depression together. They had been in the war together, and they had come out of it together, many of them benefiting from the GI Bill and other things like that. By the time you get to be 25, 30 years later, you begin to realize that, first of all, a lot of the people that you talk to at that time aren't around anymore. And the younger people are not necessarily feeling any real threat to them. All volunteer army, a lot of us protested that war in Vietnam, and gee, it may have entered our mind that we did not want to go as individuals, as well as the fact that it was a bad war. But, I always think, for some reason, I always think of the car dealers. So the, car dealer in our town might be a guy who is open to occasionally voting for a Democrat, was basically a Republican, but very community oriented, and feeling an obligation to others. It seemed to me that the sons and daughters felt no compulsion to worry about the other people in the community or around the country. And that somehow that spirit that we're all in this together was lost. So that, to me, we have to figure out how to get back to a common American identity. And I do think that one of the worst turning points for this was the couple of months right after President Obama, while he was president-elect. So I went around the country, went around the state finishing my listening sessions. And all of a sudden, all these people started showing up who were like super angry. Even the state had voted overwhelmingly for Obama, including in the northern areas. And all of a sudden, these people with fire in their eyes coming in and saying, he's a socialist, he wasn't born in the United States, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. And he hadn't even been sworn in yet. And I saw something completely different, to the point where people would always come to my town meetings, were scared and didn't want to come anymore. I don't like having to say this, but I do believe that there were racist and other elements to this, and it was not economics. It was something else that suddenly came out and helped fuel the Tea Party movement, which was not just about that, in fairness, but it was a turning point and has led to a lot of problems.
I find that very persuasive, and I have a hunch many folks would think that. I just don't think it is American history. I think it's an imagined history. America is a place where there have been multiple identities. If you go back and you look at our history carefully, not through the lens of this kind of, what I would say is a liberal tradition view, you would see at the American Revolution, there were all sorts of views that were completely contrary to what you're talking about. The 1830s, which was the height of the so-called Jacksonian Revolution, in which vast numbers of people are voting for the first time. This is also the moment where there are violent expulsions. Catholics, Mormons, abolitionists, Native Americans. Then the Civil War, which is a remarkable event, a revolutionary event in ending slavery. But it's also followed by Reconstruction, which establishes Jim Crow and a legalized racist society, up through George Wallace in the 1960s and 1970s, who ran on defending segregation as necessary to protect individual rights. So here's someone who is claiming this liberal tradition about the Bill of Rights and saying segregation upholds it. So expulsion, racism, This seems to me part of it. Now, I come to today because I don't think it's one or two people. I'm following the emergence of the national conservatism. J.D. Vance is part of it, but there's a large group of people, and they are saying something the same things you are, that we've lost our identity as a country. We've lost that identity. What is that identity? It is the centrality of the Christian white male. It is family ties to the land. So I think what you're talking about is important, but I think it's one among many efforts, traditions with deeply embedded in our history that are competing for that idea that they define the tradition and that they know what American identity is.
And they have the right to compete, and they should. But the difference is, and by the way, I don't know if you've read American Midnight. It's a book about the period between 1917 and 1921, which was written by Adam Hochschild, who wrote my favorite book, King Leopold's Ghost. But it's a period that has a lot of similarities. You're right. In fact, unbelievable number of similarities to what's going on now. The difference is the president of the United States was not the leading cheerleader for it. The president of the United States cannot be the person who promotes, who literally fans the flames of racism and hatred and division going against the American identity I'm talking about. It's the one I, of course, believe in, given my background, which is you don't have to be part of this, the original part of the country, that we are all welcome here, as is suggested in the Statue of Liberty, and that is our identity, is being a place where anybody can come from around the world and be included if they play by the rules. So, yes, there have been such trends, but I think, in my view, of course, subject to the Civil War discussion, this is an unprecedented level of loss of common feeling among Americans for each other.
There's no doubt that you're pointing to something that's very real. I think many people feel that way and have the sense of loss of that common identity. Yet we do have President Andrew Jackson, who was an out-and-out racist. He was the guy who led the Trail of Tears, which expulsed, hundreds of thousands of Native Americans, with thousands and thousands being killed. And by the way, African Americans were wrapped up in that. We also had Woodrow Wilson, who was also fanning these flames of racism in a variety of ways. So I appreciate what you're saying. I just think American history is more multi-layered. And I think the challenge right now, and it is a real challenge, so I encourage you to keep making this argument, but I think we're going to hear increasingly about this kind of right-leaning view of American identity, which is based on conservative white male dominance.
Well, I'm going to keep making the argument. And in fact, to paraphrase Lloyd Benson, I know Woodrow Wilson, and I know Andy Jackson, and they are no Donald Trump. That does not stand historical foundations. Of course they did bad things, and they had bad beliefs, but their presidential conduct was nothing like this person.
Okay, I got another question from the audience, wondering about whether this kind of transformation in terms of division away from American identity has been fueled by the movement of conversation and dialogue online.
Well, I'm afraid it has, but I see this in another way because, again, the years of watching the media change. The first thing I go back to is the way newspapers were when I first started running for office in 1982 or 1992. You could go to every one of Wisconsin's middle-sized or even small towns, Chippewa Falls or Portage or any of these towns, and they had their own newspaper, and they had their own editorial policy. They were usually Republican. Some of them were more ornery and Democrat. But if you went to them and talked to them, they would give you a fair shot, and sometimes they would endorse you or at least agree with you on an issue. There was an independent, community-based source of information that people cared about. Consolidation of the media, consolidation of music, entertainment, consolidation of almost everything into a system that was governed outside of our states was the first step, in my view, to destroy the idea of independent voices. The second, of course, was cable TV, Fox News, and the indoctrination that began with that. But then, of course, social media put this into overdrive. And the idea of the tunnel vision that people have, the information that they get from only certain sources, became a serious problem. Now, look, it's wrong to idealize the past. When you get older, you do that. But, those of us that remember Walter Cronkite, there were only 3 TV stations, and these people were known by everybody, and we all sort of got the same basic information every night, and we had a common conversation about it. That has been lost. And the reason I know it's a real loss is I happen to be married to a lady that's from California, but she's had her career in England, so she has a place in England, and she's got the BBC on in 5 different rooms. It's everywhere. BBC 4. Well, all the English people and British people, they all listen to that. They might think it's a little biased or, the accusations that have been made against NPR. But there is a common conversation that leads to a common identity that moderates some of the tensions. Now, that doesn't mean Nigel Farage won't be elected prime minister. He might be. But there is a very important role that's been lost in part because of what you've asked me about.
How many people here think that the ERA was not passed? I'm seeing some hands go up, and those of you who followed it closely, it wasn't passed, right? Except Russ Feingold has done research on it, and he disagrees.
Well, more than that, we got Joe Biden to say it was in the Constitution. But so this is a tricky part of the constitutional issue. So as we talked about Article 5, how is an amendment, how does it come to be? Well, the only way it's ever come to be in this country is through Congress, 2/3 each house, and then 3/4 of the states ratifying it. And the ERA was very close in the 1970s to becoming ratified, but they didn't quite get there. And Phyllis Schlafly got out there and started talking about how it was going to be a terrible thing. And she was successful, even though Congress tried to extend the deadline that it had put on. It put a 7-year deadline on. And people thought it had been stopped. But people realized about 5 years ago that there's a very good argument that there can't be any constitutional limit. The Article 5 says nothing about Congress's ability to put a time limit on top of an amendment. And so we took the view at the American Constitution Society and persuaded many law professors and ultimately the President of the United States to recognize that there was a woman that came to my class at Stanford. She said, in the next year, I'm going to get Virginia to ratify and become the 38th state. Sure enough, the legislature changed and it became the 38th state. That's all the Constitution requires. So you might say, hey, but the archivist didn't publish it. Who cares? Do you think the founders of the country thought Congress could create some bureaucrat who could say, well, it's nice that 38 states have ratified this, but I don't feel like signing it. It's part of the Constitution. Now, I am an outlier on this, but I also think I'm right.
So just to encourage you on this line, what would it take? I mean, Joe Biden, yes, you convinced him, but it was like literally in his last days in office, it may have been his last day, where he said, yeah, we ought to do this, goodbye, and walked out the door. So, I'll
tell you what it.
Yeah, what would it take?
How's it going to happen?
How is this going to happen in a way that's legitimate, people would accept?
Well, some people will never accept anything, but as a matter of fact, because if your concern is that the archivist hasn't done this, well, let's say there's an election in 2028, and on January 20th, I got the dates right, 2029, there's a new president, and that president is a woman, and there are 500 executive orders on her desk, and she reverses all the Trump executive orders, and she doesn't throw pens out into the audience as he did, but she does something else. She appoints an archivist, and she orders the archivist to publish, because the president has no authority here other than to literally say, do this. I remember one of my favorite moments watching that great movie, Lincoln, with my favorite actor. At one point, Lincoln says, you get me the 13th Amendment and I'll sign it. You didn't have to sign it. He had nothing to do with it. He was making a statement. But the founders planned that this be a direct act of the people through their Congress and through the states, and no archivist should be able to block it.
You know, I'm glad you're making this argument, and I'm also thinking there's so many areas where, I don't know, lazy thought takes over and people just accept it. And this has been decades. People have accepted
Almost
ERAs.
everybody believes that.
Yeah, ERA is dead, including lots of organizations that are committed to the rights of women.
Yes.
My concern, though, would be new president comes in, signs an executive order saying this should be adopted because it was legally ratified. That's not going to have legitimacy. It's going to provoke another sort of explosion about overreach, and
It would probably be challenged in the Supreme Court. And I would be a little nervous about what the Supreme Court would do with it. But I think it would probably be settled by the court saying, actually, this has been legally ratified. And that, I think, would settle it.
We've got a number of questions. I've been filtering some in, but let me get to more of them. The American identity has been split due to huge disparities of wealth.
Well, it's a huge part of it. And in fact, the exploitation of people's potential resentments and feelings has been exploited by extremely wealthy interests who wanted to back things like the Koch brothers and others who have supported much of this right-wing movement, which in many ways was kicked off in 2011 in my state of Wisconsin, when the Koch brothers convinced Scott Walker to destroy our labor laws and to launch a frontal attack on something that was a consensus. Republican and Democrats together always negotiated these agreements. It was not controversial. It was an attempt to divide, paid for by very wealthy interests.
Well, one of my colleagues here in political science has put in a question. And he's not at all pleased with our discussion about the impact of money. The question is, actually, political science research shows that money does not impact legislative voting. And just to expand on that, what it shows is that the money goes to legislators who already support the position of the donors in order to keep them in office. So it's not flipping votes, it's ensuring that those who are supporting stay in office.
Well, I have to be a little careful here because I was actually in the room thousands of times
Exactly.
where this happened.
Yeah. So tell us the
That's
real
not
story.
The way it happens.
Okay.
The way it happens is that somebody gets elected and they're thinking about running for re-election and they're thinking of introducing a bill to do something about AI. And all of a sudden their staff members say to them, you realize if you do this, they're going to come down on you with hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you just get a little bit hesitant. It has less to do with the election itself and more to do with the timidity that is created by the dominance of corporate and other money influences. It tends to be that. And that I would make that.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that money influences what gets on the agenda, what is being voted on. And so this AI bill, take your example, it doesn't even come up for a vote. And so my colleagues who are looking at floor votes, okay,
it doesn't.
You're missing the picture here.
Exactly. It's like what gets introduced, what doesn't get introduced, what is actually introduced, how strong is it? All of that is affected by the enormous power of campaign money, which was only really unleashed after 2010.
There has been some research on this, so maybe my colleagues will send you some articles. But I'm persuaded by.
I've seen some of their articles.
Yeah, you are in a state that in its two largest cities use ranked choice voting, and so one of our questions is, what's your view of ranked choice voting?
I've never spent a lot of time thinking about it, but I basically am open to it and comfortable with experiments with it. I think it might make sense. We have a terrible problem with people with incumbencies. And what I don't accept, though, is the idea that creating a system where candidates will be more moderate is better. Thinking here, Paul Wellstone, who used to say wonderful things about stuff like this, is that, McCain and I came together. I was one of the most left members of the Senate, and he was one of the most conservative. It wasn't about being in the middle of the road like a dead armadillo, as the former Secretary of Agriculture used to say. It was about coming together on a common view about a particular matter. And so what I fear, not necessarily with this system, but any system such as the California primary system, that purposely tries to make sure that somebody's right in the middle, to me, is not the best thing for this country.
So we just had a very important mayoral election in Minneapolis. You had a Democratic Socialists of America candidate, Senator Fateh. You had the incumbent, Jacob Frey, who I would say was progressive, but certainly moderate by comparison. So that doesn't look like moderation to me. It looks like you've got two candidates. One is, centrist left, and the other is pretty far left.
No, I'm sure it can have that consequence. All I was saying is my concern is that candidates who have stronger views on either side should still be able to have a chance.
So my former colleague, Joanne Miller, and I did some research. This is, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 years ago. And one of the things we were concerned about, because it's a consistent theme in voting, and it's known as the social and economic stratification. Those with more income, who are white, better educated, vote more, contribute more, turn out more than those who are less well educated, lower income, and people of color. Ranked choice voting has that as a real limitation, because to know the candidates, be able to choose 3 candidates, rank them, or 6 candidates and rank them, requires time, which is related to money. It requires a high level of analytic ability that you might get from a professional job in a law firm or elsewhere. And so that's kind of doubling down on the stratification that's possible in the American system.
It is a concern. It reminds me of conversations I've had in California, where I was running the American Constitution Society and talking about judges. And they say they have to go in and vote on like 100 judges. And who in the world is able to, even your most educated people might not know, but that is potentially a limitation, yes.
Okay, moving on to what happened last week with the elections. We've got a couple of questions here about that. What do you make of last Tuesday's election? Is it good news for Democrats, or does it show the divisions that exist in the Democratic Party?
Well, I think overall it's good news that people are waking up, that they can do something. They can get new governors, and they can get a new mayor in New York, and there were races all over the country like that. I think it'd be a huge mistake for people to get cocky about it. But what I do think is important is that, and I've felt this way for a long time, especially when I used to talk to Paul Wellstone about it, is it would be a mistake to think that it's bad to have more left-leaning and progressive candidates. I think it's a good thing. I think that Mamdani is a positive influence from the point of view of engaging young people in the political process. And I think that the presidential candidates, there should be some that reflect that view. And, I think in the end, to have a real chance to win the presidency back, you're going to need younger people who are motivated. So I think that was the most positive thing, to see the success of some of those folks, such as, frankly, AOC, who I think has acquitted herself very, very well.
Yeah, the word inside is that AOC is going to be challenging Schumer in the primary, and precisely in the terms you're talking about.
I think that could happen.
Here's another kind of observation about the election. It's true, Mamdani mobilized youth. Okay, it's a liberal, progressive, left-leaning city of New York. But then you had the elections in New Jersey and Virginia of candidates who were moderate, who were, related, came out of the kind of national security environment. And that points to this division, that if you are going to win nationally, the Democratic Party has to find a path that does not alienate the swing voter.
Well, I think it's perfectly possible to have a national candidate who both people on the left and people that are more moderate on national security can be comfortable with. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's going to be a deal breaker. I think typically it's perceptions of people, whether they think they're going to be rational and responsible president that will help people come together behind a candidate. But, it's obviously a risk.
I'm
It's a
just,
big tent.
I'm picking up vibes here. People want me to ask, which candidates in the Democratic Party do you think should run for the Democratic nomination?
Well, I think Tim Walz should run.
He's got,
And I would say a different one in Illinois. No, look, I'm not going to go through the names. I threw a name out a few seconds ago.
AOC.
I guess I didn't say her whole name, but
Okay, that's interesting.
but I'm not endorsing. And I think there's a very strong argument for having a strong governor, such as, I won't say names, but Michigan, Kentucky, Illinois, California, Pennsylvania, North Carolina. Those are all pretty cool people.
Do you think Newsom has kind of jumped out ahead given what he's been doing with the redistricting in California?
No, I think he's been smart about getting out. Whether he can hold it, I think it's going to be tough, but he's pretty skilled.
Another question along these lines, but looking towards the 2028 election, how can we ensure that elections in November of 2026 and then in 2028 are secure from the interference of the president or MAGA?
Well, I'm extremely worried about that. I don't know if we can ensure it. It depends on the place, whether various election commissions have been intentionally populated by people who might twist the process. In Wisconsin, there's been a pretty good pushback on attempts to corrupt the process, and I'm hoping that it's protected in the future. But I am very concerned about it, and I'm not. A lot will depend on, in terms of the presidential election, on whether or not there's a change in Congress next year. That, the Constitution really gives us authority to the Congress as well as to the states.
We now move into the Constitution set of questions this afternoon. Can you talk about the attacks on Venezuela and boats that the Trump administration claims are a national security threat?
I think it's completely unlawful. I still believe in Article 1 of the Constitution, which requires that Congress should approve, or at least the War Powers Act should be followed with regard to those processes. This violates it. It violates it to the point where the British have now cut us off from intelligence because of this. It is a completely lawless operation. And what else can I say? It should be an impeachable offense.
You heard it here, folks.
Don't hold your breath.
There seems to be broadening concern about the state of the Constitution and what you described as lawlessness. We had out here last spring a well-known advocate among conservatives and Republicans, Jack Goldsmith, who served a very important office in the Justice Department under George Bush. He's a professor at Harvard. And he came out and we had a very robust discussion in which he concluded that there were fundamental problems with the Constitution. So that's, and he was someone who helped found the Federalist Society. So that's, I would say center right, not far right, but center right. And then we've got, your perch, and particularly the American Constitution Society, which is thought of as kind of the progressive version of the Federalist Society. Do you think that reflects a kind of broad concern about where the Constitution is and what needs to change moving into the future?
Well, the first part, I think, is pretty clear. There is a growing belief that the Constitution isn't working nearly as well as we thought it would. And, I sort of watched this happen when I was in the Senate, because I don't think it's the original document that is necessarily flawed, although it is with regard to the Electoral College. But it's what has happened historically with Congress not asserting its rights and its prerogatives under the Constitution. I mean, this began in earnest with regard to Article 2 and intermilitary interventions under Theodore Roosevelt, who, of course, in many ways I admired, but was very aggressive about military interventions. And he started doing these, and the Congress didn't assert itself. And as a result, it became the law, basically, that the president could do all kinds of things without a declaration of war. We haven't even had a declaration of war since World War II, not even 9/11. So that was one area. In other areas, of course, not necessarily a bad thing, but in terms of treaties, the Constitution says that treaties have to be passed by 2/3 of the Senate. But what happened in the past century is that things that kind of look like treaties but are called executive agreements. My friend of mine from our common experience together before, Harold Coe, is the leading scholar on this at Yale Law School. It's essentially displaced treaties in many cases, so there's no longer the 2/3 vote requirement. So you can go through the various parts of the Constitution. Now you've got a president who's trying to get the explicit tariff provision in the Constitution. So we have lost the balance between Congress and the presidency, which, many times I'd make the argument and people would say, Russ, no president's ever going to do that. Well, we found one. And of course, he was smart enough to rig the Supreme Court first so that he wouldn't be pushed back.
I taught for many years with Walter Mondale, and Mr. Mondale used to say, talking about Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, that his great concern was over the last 3 decades, since the legislation in the 70s, the backlash against Watergate, that a loaded gun was left in the White House. That just to take your example about war powers, we've had literally hundreds of cases of presidents sending troops into active areas of hostilities. President Obama was using drones to commit assassinations in Somalia of what he considered to be terrorists. Rand Paul was one of the few to come out and say this is murder, it violates Article 1, and we've got to stop it. So my point here is that Donald Trump is not alone. Donald Trump is building and taking it further, but building on precedents set by Democrats and Republicans.
That was my point.
Yeah.
The difference is if there's a loaded gun on the table is if you pick it up and start shooting everything. If you happen to see a story about Nigeria, we don't have any idea what's going on or understand it at all, and you threaten to invade Nigeria. I don't think Walter would have imagined somebody could go this far, but fundamentally, it's right. It said nobody would even thought you could do this, and no Supreme Court would entertain these arguments in the past.
Well, talking about the Supreme Court, we've got several questions here about the Supreme Court, and we're going to assume that you're not a fan of the direction of the decisions. But here's one question: should the Supreme Court be expanded? If not, why not? And could you just describe what that?
So one of the things I did as president of the American Constitution Society was sort of lead the effort to have us endorse the idea of at least a temporary expansion of the Supreme Court and also the elimination of life tenure. And there are those who, first of all, adding seats to the court does not require constitutional amendment. This court has been different sizes in the history. It's been 7, it's been 6, it's been 9. And my view is that the court was stolen, essentially completely stolen. Barack Obama had the right to replace Scalia. That seat was stolen. When Justice Ginsburg passed away, when people were already voting and they immediately rushed through another justice, that seat was essentially stolen. And so the court has been at least temporarily stolen from the American people and certainly from the U.S. Senate. And so my view is that as at least a temporary measure, they should add 2 seats. Maybe they put some kind of a limitation on have the seats expire, but to somehow undo what to me was unconscionable. The other thing is, I think we're ready to not have a life term for members of the Supreme Court, especially because people can live to be 120 now. And that doesn't mean they won't still be good judges, but let's face it, what Justice Ginsburg went through, just physically, trying to stay alive, trying to be in there because of this, it was a horrible thing to watch. And then to see people pressured to quit before they want to quit because there happens to be a Democratic president. Many have proposed that each president gets every 2 years a choice while they're president for the Supreme Court, and that it become regularized. And that so it would still be connected to the will of the American people in elections. But those are some reforms that I support and that the American Constitution Societies.
And of course, President Joe Biden was opposed to these ideas in the past, originally, and then
was I until I saw this theft.
My question though is, why didn't Joe Biden, make this happen? He had people coming up with proposals, and he basically sat him down and didn't move on.
Well, he ultimately endorsed adding to the number. The reason he did it is, I was sitting next to him for 18 years on Judiciary Committee, and we all believed that there were some norms that people follow, and that you shouldn't mess around with the size of the court, or your life tenure is good because people have independence, and we, all those arguments seemed reasonable, and I was persuaded by them until I saw somebody break the rules of how justices were chosen. And I think for President Biden, it was very difficult to come to that point earlier. I wish he had.
Do you think Justice Ginsburg should have stepped down earlier to give President Obama a shot?
Yes.
Oh. Okay, moving on in our theme about elections. Do you see the primary process as contributing to divisions within each party and between the parties?
I think the primary process is a very healthy thing, of course, depending on how it's set up, because people need to be basically have tryouts to see how they do, and they need to go to all different parts of the country and understand who they're trying to represent as president. So I realize there's been fights about this sort of thing over the years. Some of these guys are trying to get me to run for president once, so they took me to New Hampshire. And I get up there and I give my little speech, and then it's the Q&A time. And the MC's this old New England guy, and he goes, "The first question is, do you support the New Hampshire primary as the first primary?" And I said, "Oh, absolutely." And he said, "You can put away the tar and feathers now." But there's a charming aspect, and it's more than that. I mean, it's unfortunate that Iowa really screwed up with its thing last time, because I think the Iowa caucuses had some merit as well. But yeah, I do think that the primaries for president anyway are, and certainly I think it's a great thing in a state like mine, where I never would have had a chance if there wasn't a primary. The bosses, the big guys in the state capitol would have never given me, they wouldn't have given me the time of day. I had the opportunity to get out there and cover the state and do a populist campaign like Paul Wellstone taught me to do.
So here's one of the concerns about primaries. It's true about both parties, but especially the Republican Party. When you look at turnout, it's very low, 10, 15%. And then you say, well, who is turning out? And it tends to be the more liberal parts of the Democratic Party and the far more conservative right-wing parts of the Republican Party. So Donald Trump, how does he get nominated when he's competing against a whole slew of candidates, many of whom would have fit the kind of conservative Republican tradition that you were referring to? That's the concern about the primaries, that it's evaded the kind of Madisonian idea of checks.
Well, I think there's a decent argument there, but I certainly, based on my experience, know that a primary is an opportunity for a person to show that they can be a progressive and still be responsible, and to become a candidate like Fighting Bob LaFollette from Wisconsin, Gaylord Nelson, myself, some of your senators here. I have found that senators who come in who have maybe if you call left-leaning focus, and sometimes right-leaning. I mean, some of the folks that I worked with in the Congress and the Senate were conservative, but they were, like, of course, Barry Goldwater, to many people, was a great principled senator. I didn't like him when he ran at 64, but I was 12. So I don't accept the idea that this is somehow a gift to the elites. It certainly didn't feel that way to me. I felt like it was a real populist movement, and I think what you did here with Wellstone in that primary was similar.
A question about guns. When you were in the Senate, you voted. This was part of your independent streak. You voted on both sides of the issue on guns. Looking back, what's your view about gun control?
Same view I've had them all my life. I grew up around people that I never had a gun, never wanted a gun. But, I grew up in a town in Janesville, Wisconsin, where there was a deer hunting rifle over the mantle. You never saw it around. I never saw a gun anywhere. But people believed in the right to have guns to go hunting primarily. In some of the cities, people certainly believe that a handgun is important for self-defense, which I don't disagree with necessarily. I don't want one myself, but I don't think you can necessarily take that right away from somebody. So when I was an ornery undergraduate, I wrote my senior honors thesis on this provision of the Constitution called the Second Amendment that nobody took seriously. And I said, I think this is going to become a big deal. And I said, it's going to become an individual right to bear arms argument. And this is what happened. I was beginning to pick up some of the literature from some of the more conservative schools. And it's a very, I think it's not only difficult, but a wrong argument to suggest that people have no right to have guns. That doesn't mean you can't limit it. I voted for every background checks. I voted for almost every provision. In fact, I voted, I did something that Bernie Sanders didn't do. I voted against gun makers having immunity from liability, which I think is ridiculous. That doesn't have anything to do with the right to bear arms. But no, I think the right answer, and one of the biggest mistakes the Democratic Party's ever made, is to somehow be perceived as wanting to take away everyone's guns, which is not necessarily to solve this problem. It is a horrible problem, but you don't solve it by prohibition.
Russ Feingold, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. If you give me a minute, I want to just tick off a few announcements. Next Tuesday, November 18th, we're going to have the next installment of our Mondale Dialogues, which highlights the decency and fairness that guided the public life of Walter Mondale. For this event, we're going to be having PBS host Alexander Hefner, who's been working on how to engage the public in public budgeting. Talk about a tough act, but he's really been working on this. That'll be available it'll be available online only. There will be a video recording on YouTube up in 1 to 2 days. Please, get it, share it, and we encourage you to register to get more of our programs. Finally, if you enjoyed this event, please consider making a donation. All these programs are brought to you by people who are contributing to them. Once again, thank you so much, Russ Feingold, and thank all of you for joining us, including online.